All right, guys. Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. We're doing something a little bit different today. I'm having Pastor Matthew Spandler-Davison come in and talk to us a little bit about his organization, 20 Schemes. He will be with us Sunday preaching the Word, and you'll get a chance to meet him face to face. But I figured it would be good just to talk for a little bit and to go over a few things. So, Matthew, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your church and kind of your background?
Hey Daniel, good to chat with you. Looking forward to being with you guys on Sunday. So I am originally from Scotland, born in Stavanger, Norway, to an English mum and Irish dad. Grew up in Scotland. My wife is from Mobile, Alabama, hence I moved to Kentucky. So that's me in a nutshell. And, I have the notoriety of being one of the first churches to hire you.
It is. You're not just one of the first church to hire me.
The first. So
The first. Yes. I think it might have been your first hire too.
Yeah, I think we were both in middle school.
Yeah.
I had no idea what we were doing.
No, definitely not.
Not only were you my first hire, but you're the only one who actually applied for the job.
That's true. Well, that's why I got it. So, hey, you have no experience and no ability to do what we ask you to do, but hey, why not try? So, good opportunity. So, felt like I learned a lot there.
Moved to Kentucky to go to Southern Seminary. So I grew up in Scotland, came to faith when I was about 18. Scotland, as we'll come on to explain shortly, is for the most part unreached. And so there's no Christians in my family that I knew of, certainly in my high school. I didn't know of any other believers, didn't really meet Christians until later on in my life as a teenager. There's a mission team that came from the States to the UK, to Scotland, and that's when I met actually my wife, who was on that team from Mobile, University of Mobile. So came to faith when I was 18. Initially was pursuing career in politics, got a degree at Aberdeen Uni in politics, then felt a burden for ministry, particularly church planting in Scotland. But there was no seminary, Bible college, really a decent one back then in Scotland. So that's why I moved to Louisville to go to Southern Seminary. A friend of mine encouraged me to go there, check it out. And so we moved there. And while I was there, I planted the church that I still pastor today. So back in 2004, we planted that church.
Nice. All right. Well, what is 20 Schemes? And why don't you give me a little history of that and its purpose? What are y'all trying to accomplish?
Yeah, so 20 Schemes is we exist to see gospel preaching churches in Scotland's poorest communities. And so when we think of Scotland, we think of golf, kilts, Braveheart, Loch Ness Monster, mountains, lakes, whiskey. And this kind of when we think of Scotland, but the reality is Scotland is for the most part unreached. We estimate between 2 and 3% of Scotland would be evangelical, Bible-believing Christian. There's been a kind of a collapse of Christianity across most of Western Europe since the Second World War. And I would say that would be true in all of Western Europe. I think Western Europe is the spiritual wasteland in the world today when it comes to unengaged communities. It's not post-Christian. Many people think of Europe as being post-Christian, where there's still remnants of Christianity. From my experience, communities that we're working in, I'd say is pre-Christian. There's no living memory of Christianity in some of these communities. There is no, so it's not like this is the church my grandfather went to. This may have been the church that great-great-great-grandfather went to. So there's no living memory of Christianity in some of the communities that we'll be doing ministry in. And so, like I said, I grew up there, felt a burden for Scotland, moved to the States, always had that heart, planted a church in Kentucky, but then looking to see how can we then see churches planted amongst the unengaged communities of Scotland. So back in 2012, met a guy named Mes McConnell, who is a pastor of a church in Edinburgh, Scotland, called Niddrie Community Church. Church back then of about 40 or 50 people, right in a very, very poor community in Edinburgh called a scheme. So a scheme is the equivalent in the US, somewhat of social housing. Think of the projects, kind of inner city housing. Government subsidized housing would be housing schemes in Scotland. So here's you got a church that is gospel-centered, gospel preaching, seeing conversion growth. It's got a pastor who himself has come out of prison, come out of drug addiction, came to faith, revitalized this church, seeing conversion growth from the most unlikely of communities. And so I felt a burden to get alongside him, for our church to partner with his church. And the fruit of that relationship and that partnership is this ministry called 20 Schemes. And our desire is to see churches planted. Vision was 20 churches planted in Scotland's poorest communities. And so we launched that about 7 years ago now.
Okay. About how many churches have y'all planted so far?
So we have church planting teams, so a church planter in 7 locations across Scotland. We've launched 4 churches. And so we have in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, we have existing church plants. We've got a church plant up in Inverness. And so we have 7 church planting teams right now where we have full-time on-the-ground ministry teams doing evangelism, disciple making. It's very ministry happens very slow in Scotland. It's quite hostile to the gospel. The communities that we're doing work in, you've got serious issues of drug addiction, mental health issues, abuse. So just ministry in that kind of context anyway is very hard, very difficult. And so it takes a long time to see a convert. And then from that point to then get to a point where we can launch a church. So it's about 5 years. We've only been at it 7 years. So I would estimate between 3 and 5 years from the moment you move into a community until you see maybe a church begin to gather there.
Okay. Thinking about poverty ministry in general, how do you typically see good-hearted churches doing poverty ministry wrong?
So when we think of doing ministry to the poor, so whether that is on the mission field in a place like Haiti or whether that is in our own cities, we tend to think of ministry to the poor as mercy ministries. And so we're going to go and maybe we'll hand out something. So we'll go and do a food drive or food bank, or we'll go and help a shelter, or we'll run a back to school, after school program, or an ESL class. And so we think of ministry to the poor as these ministries, these mercy ministries. Now, those things aren't bad in and of themselves, but after decades of churches pumping millions of dollars into these kind of relief mercy ministries, the question that we want to ask is, how have these been effective in doing the work that we are called to do as Christians, which is to make disciples? How many disciples have been made from that homeless shelter? How many disciples have been made from that back to work program? How many disciples have been made from that ESL class? And if that's the metric, we have to measure everything we do in all that we do, no matter what ministry we're part of, is go and make disciples. And so we think the most effective mercy ministry is a healthy local church. And so if you really want to see true transformation take place, whether it's in the heart of a individual or the life of a community, then it has to be the presence of a healthy local church that does works of mercy. So far better to have a healthy church in the heart of a community that is inviting people into homes and around dinner tables than a church from the suburbs driving in and doing a Wednesday night meal for poor kids, which we think is actually counterproductive. Because those kind of ministries tend to be quite, so the way I equate it is they're transactional instead of relational. So we're going to come and do a transaction. So we're going to hand you something, but then we're going to leave. Whereas when you look at the New Testament, ministry happens through relationship. It's relational. I want to get to know you. I want to get to know your story. I want to get to know your hurts, your pains, your struggles. I want to introduce Jesus to you. I want to introduce the truth of the gospel to you. I want to walk with you through that. And that's much harder. Much easier for a church to write a check and to fund and to send a mission team for 1 week in a year than it is to invest long-term in gospel transformation work, which involves moving in, incarnating into a community and seeing evangelistic disciple-making growth happening. And so the difference is transactional approach as opposed to relational gospel approach.
Okay, good. How has all this COVID-19 stuff impacted 20 Schemes particularly?
Yeah, so I mean, in significant ways. So on the ground in Scotland, Scotland's gone through a really uh, serious shutdown, lockdown. People in America think they've been locked down, but they really haven't been locked down. I mean, we think that, just because the restaurant is closed, we think we've been locked down. In Scotland, I mean, you literally couldn't leave your house. Maybe once a week you can go to the store. One person from your house could go to your store, and that lasted almost at least maybe 10 weeks. So it's been real lockdown where people have been prevented from leaving their homes, going to work. And now the knock-on effect of that is they've been very good at eliminating the virus. There's been no deaths, no transmission of the virus over the last couple of weeks. And so in one sense, it proved effective. But when you're in a poor community where there is already prevalence of mental health issues, of abuse and addictions, lockdown really exacerbates all those issues. If you're living in an abusive relationship, then your ability to be able to leave and go to work is your safe place. Your ability to be able to leave and hang out with friends is your safe place, and you've not been able to have access to that. If you've got depression or schizophrenia or even suicidal tendencies, then lockdown really exacerbates those issues. And so what we've noticed in our communities is an increase in drug overdoses, increase in abuse, and an increase in suicide. And so, and yet a hampering of our ability to respond to that in terms of ministering to people who we know and we care about and we're trying to get to. So we've been trying to adapt to that. Our church planters have been doing walk-bys. We'll walk by and just kind of speak to people from the street, from their home. We'll do WhatsApp chats, try to do Zoom calls and so forth. But yeah, it's definitely the need, the ministry need has been greater, but the ministry opportunity has been reduced. That's had a significant impact. Now churches are able to start gathering again in Scotland, or small groups can gather again with still serious restrictions. And so we're hoping that now we've got the opportunity to continue to serve and minister to people. Now for 20 Schemes, kind of big picture, it's definitely affected our ability to Scotland's one of the most expensive places in the world to live. And so a ministry like ours has to constantly be thinking about raising money to support our church planters and workers on the ground. And this year, we've just really struggled to, and we've seen our income go down as churches have seen their income go down. Our ability to fundraise has been hampered by our inability to travel. So we're just praying that we're able to keep our church planters and workers on the ground. We had to furlough 26 staff, hoping to be able to bring them back on, hopefully in the next couple of months, if we see things pick back up again. So yeah, it's been a tough year for us.
Yeah, definitely. It's terrible, honestly. It's just terrible across the world. Question for you. Do churches have a biblical responsibility to the poor? A lot of times we would say, yes, we need to bring the gospel to the poor, but do the churches have a biblical responsibility to take care of some of the physical need of the poor? Is that something that is that just a choice, or do we feel like that's a thing that the Bible tells us to be a part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly we do, but I think it's a false dichotomy that it's a choice. It's not a choice, it's both and, but you can't do one without the other. And so, so you can't assume that just because you're feeding somebody, you're doing gospel work. That isn't gospel work. It could lead to gospel work, but that's not gospel work. But if you're just going to stand on the street corner and preach the gospel and you're not feeding them, then that's inadequate and ineffective work. And so I think, so if you look at Isaiah 58, when it talks about what worship, this is the kind of worship I demand. It's not just fasting and singing and praying. The kind of worship I demand is that you go and feed the hungry, take care of the slave, you come alongside those who are hurting and broken. And so God does care significantly. It's not just a matter of our Christian duty. I think it's an act of worship that we bring the light of the gospel into hard places by extending acts of mercy as an expression of the love of Christ, and to give us an opportunity then to speak of Christ, to bring people to the hope in Jesus. And so, I mean, Jesus models that for himself. And so he does feed the hungry.
Right.
So with the example of him feeding the 5,000, he sees the hungry. He does have pity for the poor or the sick or the mentally ill. and he brings healing, and he never stops there. So when he feeds the hungry, and then he gets on the boat and heads to the other side of the lake, and then the crowd comes and follows him because they want another meal. I mean, that's your soup kitchen, right? Every week, the crowd's coming back for another meal. But Jesus rebukes them and says, I am the bread of life. If you don't come to me, then you'll always be hungry. And so it's inadequate just to feed the hungry. But Jesus always begins by feeding the hungry. And so it's inadequate just to preach the gospel, although I wouldn't say it's not just preaching the gospel. I'm saying as we preach the gospel, we also have to make sure that we're reflecting the very character of Christ in the way in which we're demonstrating acts of love, mercy, charity, compassion for those who are truly hurting and broken on our own doorsteps.
Okay, that's good. So how could a normal-sized church, it's not a big church, we're not a First Baptist, how can a church like ours partner with 20 Schemes, and even beyond that maybe, how could we even get involved in poverty ministry in our own area? What would you suggest?
So on the posture of 20 Schemes, it really doesn't matter the size of your church. We have 20 Schemes is supported by church partners. Most of our church partners tend to be small churches or church plants who would give certainly financially, but we say three things: pray, give, come. So pray regularly for the work, the benefit of ministry like ours, that we're English speaking. It's able for us to be able to communicate with each other and connect with each other pretty readily, to adopt a church planter and a particular community, to pray often for them, for your kids ministry, to pray for them, for your senior adults, to regularly pray for them, to get to know stories, to celebrate with them when they have a win, to pray for them when having a challenge, to really be involved relationally with the work, to be an encouragement to them, to give, whether that is putting us in your missions budget, whether that is taking up a special offering, whatever that looks like, to encourage your members to give towards the work of 20 Schemes. Like I've said, it's incredibly expensive. Cost of living is very high. Cost of property is very high. So doing ministry in a place like Scotland is super expensive. And then third, come and do a mission trip, an internship, maybe even send people long-term to come and join us. And we have a very long-term view of those kind of trips. We don't do like poverty safaris or Christian tourism. We just want people to come and those that you already developed a relationship with. So we only accept mission trips from partners because we see mission trips as a way of keeping to strengthen that relationship and that partnership between partner churches. And so those are ways that we can connect with each other on the ground in Scotland. And for you guys, even there where you're at in South Carolina, I would say just find out what's already happening. The most effective thing that we can do in the US is really get along existing struggling churches who are already doing ministry in poor communities or inner cities, and to be a resource to them, not a control authority kind of resource, but a support and encouragement alongside them. And so I would find where there is already work happening, whether it's in a Hispanic church or inner city work, then get alongside them, develop a close relationship with that pastor, with those church leaders, be an encouragement to them, and see a church revitalized or strengthened, or a church planter come alive. I'd put your man hours, your dollars, investing in that more than perhaps doing kind of other mercy ministries in the city.
Okay, thank you. What would you recommend for people to either watch or read or listen to for more information? They're like, hey, I got this, but what's my next step? What book would you recommend? Or maybe there's a podcast out there. Maybe there's there's a lot of documentaries nowadays. Yeah. Is there anything in particular that you found been really helpful when people are trying to get more information on this?
So we have our website, 20schemesequip.com. So it's a resource website. So 20schemes.com, find out about our ministry. 20schemesequip.com. It's more of a resource for those doing ministry to the poor. So there's a bunch of articles on there. We've got a podcast on there, some video teaching series. Also, we've got some online courses that we're about to put up there, women's ministry, leadership development, abuse, child protection stuff that we'll be putting out on that website. So 20schemesequip.com. There's a bunch of resources. There's also some book reviews on there that will lead you to see some good books that would be helpful. So certainly Church in Hard Places would be a good book to read. When Helping Hurts is an excellent book to read. Even if you want like a non-Christian perspective on poverty, a book called Poverty Safari. Here in the US, Hillbilly Elegy. Those kind of give you kind of a good kind of non-Christian perspective on poverty in the US and just a better understanding of it. But those would be some resources that I'd go to initially.
Okay. Yeah, I read Hillbilly Elegy a couple of years ago. I thought that was excellent. A real good book. Him not being a Christian, but it really opened your eyes and from his growing up in West Virginia and stuff like that.
Poor communities in more rural places like where I'm at here in Kentucky rings very true. I mean, this is the reality of for a lot of people growing up in those communities.
Right. That's right. That's right. Is there anything else that you wanted me to ask or wanted people to know about what you do and anything like that?
No, I think we covered most of it. I think, this, I guess one thing is that, these issues are true all over the world, right? So issues of poverty. So whether you're in a poor community, whether you're in Rio de Janeiro or in Nairobi, Edinburgh, Scotland, or Lexington, South Carolina, there tend to be some similarities in areas of poverty. So we tend to be high level of abuse, addiction, mental health issues, low level of literacy, tend to be more of a matriarchal leadership, and maybe a lower level of education or illiteracy in the community. So ministry looks different. Evangelism looks different. Discipleship looks different. Church planting looks different. And we do ministry well in areas of poverty. And so but most churches in those communities tend to be under-resourced and struggle. And so why, when you look at a city, why is it that most of the healthy gospel preaching churches aren't in the poor parts of our cities? It's not because there's not people there. It's because it's just harder to do work there. It's just more expensive because there's just you need more long-term external support to keep things going. So there's a reason why ministry doesn't happen well. And so we just got to think of got to change our attitude about what ministry looks like and what church planning looks like in the areas of poverty in our own cities, and then even the way we do missions and the way we think about global missions.
That's good, man. A lot of good stuff. I'm thankful for what you've been doing. It's been amazing to kind of see, and knowing you for a while, and kind of see this idea, knowing that you always had a passion for Scotland and going back and being a part of that and seeing how God is just taking that passion and growing it from a little idea. I remember I think when you and Mez first met, we all kind of stayed together together for the gospel. That was, I guess that might have been 2012. It might have been around that time when y'all were just kind of like forming the idea of what does this look like, and to see it blossom and grow and be successful and all that kind of stuff, and churches planted and seeing it really do some really good things. I think it's pretty amazing. So,
Great part of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to end this. Man, we're going to be praying for you. We're looking forward to seeing you come in here and be a part of our church and lead us to the Word and all that kind of stuff. Okay, man?
Good. I appreciate it.
See you.